Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? If you kindly take your seats. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Well, we've spent together very busy 3 days, and I hope that these 3 days were extremely exciting and inspiring in intellectual terms, largely because of the fact that we are so wonderfully different people regarding our backgrounds, theoretical, intellectual, disciplinary, geographical backgrounds, the fact that we belong to different communities of memory, and even to different generations, which is also important. But in spite of all of that, we still are able to communicate meaningfully across the boundaries of difference, to quote Richard Sennett once again, which is, I think, a great achievement of this meeting, during which the initial idea of the conference has necessarily dissolved into the number of special sessions, workshops, debates. And now it's time to put all those pieces together again, or at least to try to take all those threads and make a loom again. This is going to be the task of our closing session, and we will be assisted in this difficult task by Professor Jeffrey Olick, who kindly agreed to address the most important topics that we've been discussing at this conference, and to give his general picture of the main problem that we've discussed. After that, we'll have a chance for the last time before that conference becomes a memory to take the floor and to give our final comments about the conference. Thank you, Professor Olick. The floor is yours.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for this invitation and for 3 extremely stimulating days. I've learned a lot, but as is always the case, it's not exactly what I expected to learn, which is all the better. Now that everyone is well and exhausted, it's my task to entertain you for 20 minutes. If I've understood my task, it's in some way to serve as a discussant for the entire conference as a whole. I am sure that I'm not up to that task, so what I want to do in almost a list-like fashion is to give you some general impressions that I had as I was listening to all the excellent papers and discussions, and to raise some concerns. I should say that one of the things I learned in this conference is a new sensitivity to a sensitivity that exists here, namely a sensitivity about outsiders coming to a particular location with a model of how to remember or how to talk about memory, and instructing people, communities, a nation on how they in fact should do it. And so as an outsider, I'm very hesitant to make any kind of general prescriptions. But I should say that my outsider status, at least in the context of this meeting, is less a matter of being from the United States, something that I usually deny in European company. Put the little Canada flag on the back of the backpack. There's something more serious to that, though, which is that in terms of sensibilities, I feel more comfortable and at home here than I often do in the United States. But my outsider status is perhaps in a somewhat different context, at least to the way in which the discussion has run in this meeting, and that is that for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to speak as a general theorist of memory, social memory, collective memory processes, rather than as someone steeped in a particular case. to be sure, I have spent a lot of time looking at one particular case, namely the German case, and several others as well, but I know almost nothing about Poland. Well, about 90% of what I know about Poland I've learned in the last 3 days. So again, thank you to the organizers. But it's as a theorist and a generalist about the problem of collective memory and the existence or the institutional future of an enterprise that we could call memory studies that I'm going to speak. I'm reminded of the old cliche that therapists use when they're dealing with families, and that is that all families are dysfunctional, but every family is dysfunctional in its own way. And that's something that I've experienced attending a very large number of memory conferences in different countries around the world. And so out of this unique dysfunction in each of these places, I want to try to speak generally about the situation of memory and of memory studies. Several of the papers or presentations that I heard over the last 3 days argued for overcoming various dichotomies, complexifying situations, not seeing Poland versus Germany, Central or Eastern Central Europe versus the West, top versus bottom, official memory versus vernacular memory, overcoming all of these kinds of dichotomies for a much more complex appreciation of connections, entanglements, what have you. Now, I'm just as much in favor of overcoming dichotomies as the next guy. Nevertheless, there are a few dichotomies or distinctions that I think need to be at least articulated before they are overcome. And in the course of the discussion, I saw some conflations, which I'd like to try to disentangle, even recognizing that that's against the spirit of the conversation. The principal distinctions that I'd like to disentangle are, first of all, between the politics of memory and the science or scholarship of memory. And related to that, a second distinction, a distinction between the so-called memory boom and the scholarly enterprise that we would refer to as, or has been referred to as, memory studies. In the first place, it is inevitably the case that there is a relationship between scholarly work and the status of scholarship as a social enterprise and the political situation in which it exists. This is true in every country I've ever visited to talk about memory. It is true in my own country and in the work I do. Our work, our scholarship has a purpose. Our scholarship emerges from a situation, and our scholarship engages with and responds to a situation. In this, I'm reminded of the line from Yosef Yerushalmi, who wrote that a memory that does not aspire to be relevant is in danger of becoming a rampant growth or a form of death. And I certainly agree with that when we talk about our scholarship. Nonetheless, it seems to me that if our scholarship on memory is driven entirely by the complexities of the situation and by our desires for particular political outcomes, we miss the more general contours of the memory problematic. That is, first of all, again, from the outsider's perspective, the ways in which the concepts and the dynamics of memory are both specific to situations but also generalizable beyond them. A second element we miss is the way in which the attention to memory in particular countries, whether it's the United States, Germany, France, Poland, Estonia, Japan, Turkey, all places I've had these conversations, is part of a wider epochal trend. I actually have to say I was a little bit disappointed that Aleida Osman in her discussion cut out the point number 2, which for me is the most problematic and the most challenging, which is to understand why so much interest in memory now. And I think that some of the reasons are common across a number of different cases even though every case is completely unique, just like every child in your class is a unique and separate individual. One aspect of that also that we miss, a third thing that we miss in that process, is that we notice the memory boom. We notice the so-called expansion, the mania for memory that seems to be going on so many different places. If we don't maintain a distinction between the politics of memory, or our politics of memory, as diverse as that might be, we tend to also neglect the development of tools which are as able to understand the role of memory when there's not a boom. And so the analogy I would make here is to the practice of economics. If economics were to take the form that memory studies so often seems to have taken in the last 20 years, then economists would be very good at explaining a boom or an expansion and would have no explanation whatsoever for moments of bust or decline. And so it seems to me one of the things we have to do is make sure that our discourse about memory is as sensitive to and responsive not only to memory booms, but also to memory busts. Okay. The second distinction, the distinction between the memory boom and memory studies. One of the things I've been trying to sell on the road, as it were, as my traveling salesman of sociological concepts, is the idea that rumors of the memory boom or belief in the memory boom are greatly exaggerated. And I have to say that my experience in this conference has given me even more confidence in that claim. One of the interesting things I learned about the sociological tradition in Poland is that the dating of interest in and work on collective memory using the concepts from the Holblockian tradition in fact started substantially earlier in Poland than it did in a number of other places. So when people talk about Pionera 1984 through 1992 and the increase after the Historikerstreit in Germany, the late 80s, the early 90s, this expansion of interest in memory, it's difficult to explain the expansion of, or the continuity in the scholarship and the science of memory, for instance, in Poland in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And so for me, it was a great gift to learn about these traditions which have not crossed cultural and linguistic boundaries. And one of the things I'd like to see come out of this conference is some greater awareness of these alternative traditions. I should say also that another thing I thought about in the context of a memory studies that's driven by an interest particularly in the politics of memory is that this leads also, I think, to a neglect of other sources of scholarly interest in memory, namely interests that arise from disciplines like psychology and philosophy, as well as political science and sociology. Memory studies as it exists in the present, or as it has come to form in the last 15 or so years as, I think, a increasingly coherent field of scholarship, is at least significantly, I mean, I'm not going to say equally, but to an important extent, shaped by concerns and interests which I haven't heard mentioned at all in this conference. These developments may seem rather peripheral to a context in which the stakes of memory are so important politically. Nevertheless, there are autonomous, or at least as sociologists would say, exogenous causal factors that have contributed to the robustness of memory studies as a field of interest. And these are as diverse as, for instance, the fact that people are living longer and Alzheimer's disease and concomitantly neurology's interests and psychology's interests and problem of memory. The language of computer storage, the commonness of the term memory from the computer world, the fact that we're able to store in a different way and access information in a different way, the rise of an information society, transformations in the mass media, and the accessibility of the past has in fact contributed to the transformation in the way in which we use the past and in the way in which we refer to the past and the way in which we see ourselves in new electronic milieu of memory. I think that when we focus too exclusively on the politics of memory and the political situation of memory, we're missing out some of those wider cultural forces which have also contributed to the effervescence, if you will, that surround the term or the concept or the interest in memory. So it's not all about politics. I'm happy to say much more about the institutional conditions that are necessary, I think, to underwriting a robust and an enduring field that we might call memory studies or social memory studies or cultural memory studies, some of which include simply an expanded canon of references. I would congratulate the participants in this conference. I have to say that among the many conferences I've been to, this one has had, as far as I can tell, the highest level of sophistication and being informed about basic concepts about the development of the field since the days of Hallbox. There's this narrative that we tell, the first footnote in every paper I read, or one paragraph in every book you look at that says the concept of collective memory was coined by Maurice Hallbox in 1925. Then nothing happened for 50 years, 60 years. Then Pierre Nora published Lieu de Mémoire, but really we don't know anything about any of the stuff other than these two charismatic moments. One of the things that I've taken on as my project is to help memory studies move from what I think of as, in Max Weber's terms, a charismatic phase to a routinized phase. And it's not that there hasn't been charisma in the rooms over the last 3 days. I actually think that routinization and consolidation is a very good and healthy thing for the establishment of an enduring scientific perspective. And so I offer my congratulations to a very sophisticated set of papers that didn't have the standard footnote number 1, 1925, 1984. That's all we know. A few more random perspectives. One concept that I find interesting traveling around the world and listening to memory debates and the details of the complexities of memory in very different contexts is the notion of multiple realities. That we can trace back to Alfred Schutz and the phenomenological tradition in sociology. This works both in a vertical sense within particular societies and in a horizontal sense across different societies. So we all exist in cross-cutting, here I'm back to entanglements, we exist in cross-cutting but not by any means harmonious realities of memory, whether they're personal biographical realities or family realities or local contexts which intersect with the national and intersect with the regional and intersect with the international. What we have to recognize is that all of these different cross-cutting contexts or realities of memory are passing through us at any given time. What we also have to remember is that the rhythms, not just the issues, but the temporalities of these different realities of memory are in fact different at each of these levels. So just as we are right now, I am right now at the intersection 15 minutes into my lecture on the 3rd day of the conference in the 46th year of my life in the winter in the 21st century of all of these temporalities are passing through us. Each of us is, this is an addition to something that Hallbox has talked about. It's not just that we have these multiple identities, but at the intersections of these multiple identities, we also have these multiple temporalities, these multiple wavelengths, and we should resist the temptation to see all of the cycles or rhythms of memory as somehow synchronized. This is an analogous notion. We have the conjuncture, we also have the epoch, we also have the longue durée, and sometimes I think that we talk about the rhythms of memory as if they were more singular than they are. We were just, in fact, talking about the monolithic treatment of an historical epoch, for instance, 50 years of communism, as if that was just one thing and there were no internal transformations. The second dimension of these multiple realities I think of in terms of the concept of worlds of memory, that while there may be some similarities in how the dynamics of memory work, for instance, in biographies or in families, what's interesting to me is the regional contexts of memory, that there, Alida Osman referred to a more dialogical perspective. I take the concept of dialogue somewhat differently, but you know, if you go to Northeast Asia, for instance, if you go to Japan or South Korea, the memory discourse and our form of memory studies is decisively shaped by the effort to come to terms with the legacies of Japanese imperialism in China and South Korea, issues like the Nanjing massacre, issues like the South Korean comfort women, issues like Japanese nationalism and emperor worship and things like that. The question is, and the discourse of memory studies is concomitantly distinct and different when we're there, rather, for instance, than in what I've learned in the last 3 days to refer to as Eastern Central Europe, where the issues are predominated by issues of Holocaust and communism, and there's a certain competition between those concepts of memory, and our memory concepts thereby are oriented toward the temporalities of those particular memories. In contrast, for instance, to Latin America, where the concepts of memory are are more influenced by legal issues, because we're dealing with the notion of extradition and crimes of leadership in the transition to justice, which is very different than the world of memory that we have in the United States, thin as it is, which is shaped by two particular events, memory of the Vietnam War, but more importantly, I think, memory of slavery in the United States, which is seen as a very peripheral issue because the carriers of that memory are in fact politically and socially marginalized in the United States. The question is whether we can maintain the analytical distance as scholars such that we can understand what is unique and what is general across these different worlds while we theorize the relationship between our concepts of memory in these different places and in a more international and trans-historical kinds of contexts. So I guess this is a plea particularly for doctoral students to engage in comparative research. What we find is that the translatability or the ability of concepts to travel may not be quite as great as we would like. So is memory and collective memory or cultural, or are collective memory, cultural memory, social memory, or memory per se quite as easily travelable, I apologize to the translators for making up words, as we would like. And so I would like to see over the next years more comment on that. One of the influences of the attention to the politics of memory in the scholarship on memory is, I think, that it leads us to emphasize the instrumental uses of the past. That is, what we can do with the past and to the past, while paying less attention to what the past does to and with or for us. In other words, if we recognize the ways in which we use the past as tools in political debates over real resources, we need to remember as well the question of why the past is an effective tool in the first place. So it's not just a matter of how identities use the past as weapons in political struggles. It's also how those identities are constructed or influenced by the past in the first place. And both sides of that dichotomy, I think, are as important, and I saw a greater emphasis on instrumentality here. The past is both a mirror of what's really going on, but the past is also a lamp that illuminates the players on that stage. And I think I saw more mirror than lamp in a lot of the discussions. Finally, I would say one issue which I found surprising and intriguing, which I did not hear very much about in the conference, a couple of papers, a couple of contexts. And this is the concept, this is the category or discussion of religious frameworks. I think that it was surprising how little the different cultural frameworks of understanding guilt, responsibility, atonement, the ways of giving meaning to suffering, the requirements of acknowledgement, which are extraordinarily different, though in very complicated ways. For instance, within Christianity, between Protestants and all the diverse kinds of Protestantism and Catholicism. Protestantism and Catholicism have different concepts of guilt and atonement, different strategies for guilt and atonement, which lead to different forms of politics. Also, we need to add into the picture Eastern Orthodoxy, about which I know almost nothing. But something I do know somewhat more about is Jewish traditions of studying memory, or Jewish traditions of framing memory. Tzakor is the fundamental commandment. Remember. Whereas in Christianity, there is a very different emphasis on acknowledge, confess, atone, and forget. If we look in a transnational context, for instance, at the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the ideas that led to that development, Desmond Tutu's ideas about reconciliation through an acknowledgement of crimes or guilt. I think that was expecting too much. It's, for me, a far too Christian notion, too optimistic Christian notion, a concept of grace, which I think the anthropological research in South Africa has shown has existed more in name than in actuality. That's a very different attitude or approach to the past than the approach that you'll find in various strands of Judaism, where I would argue the concept of resentment, keeping the flame alive, is a more powerful source of identity and a more powerful shaper of attitudes towards these very complex issues. I think about the difference, for instance, between the confessional approach, for instance, in the German context of a figure like Karl Jaspers in his lectures on Die Schuldfrage, and an essay that I find very important to my thinking about these issues, namely the essay of Jean Amary on resentments, written in 1966, that he considers that maintaining a form of resentment is in fact the only moral, truly moral position for the survivor or the victim. That's not to say that there aren't differences. Some of you may be familiar with the debate between Amary, who is in favor of resentment, and Primo Levi, who wants to let the past go as a form of healing. But both Amary and Primo Levi are very different approaches than the confessionalism that you get, for instance, in Karl Jaspers or in a Martin Niemöller or in other Christian traditions. And so one of the questions I would have about Poland is, this is a country decisively shaped by its Catholicism. How does that feed into the discourse of memory that's going on here? And I found it somewhat surprising to hear so little about it in the course of the discourse at the conference. I've now spoken for 25 minutes, which is 5 more than I wanted and 10 less than I expected, if you know me. So I will stop there, and I hope that I've provided some stimulation to a discussion. Thanks.